Hello. Welcome. How's everybody doing today? Ready for the last one of the day? The best one for the last? I don't know about you, but it seems like, today's been fantastic. A lot of great presentations, some common themes, and you're going to see some of those come up again during our presentation, but that's good. It means a lot of us are on the same page with what we're doing. And, you're going to hear a different perspective of how we might solve some of the same problems that you guys have already been discussing. So our topic was investigate this. E-discovery is not just for litigation. So just different ways to think about using some of the techniques and tools that were traditionally used for litigation, which a lot of us have worked with, but using those to solve other problems. I'm Patrick Bilger. I'm with Reveal Data. We're an e-discovery software tool. I've been with Reveal for 10 years. In my background, originally I worked at a law firm, but I've been on the software side for the last 10 years. Our panel. We have a rock star panel. It's too bad that it's the end of the day and a lot of people are tired, but you're going to see some good ones here today. So we got Vanessa Salinas Beckstrom. She is a partner at PwC. She's based here in Dallas. She's has over 18 years of experience providing investigative compliance and e-discovery services in a variety of industries. She's a native Spanish speaker and has done extensive travel in Latin America, Europe, and Asia, and leading both combined U.S. and local engagements, cross-border investigations, anti-corruption, due diligence, and compliance engagement. So perfect for this topic. So there's Vanessa. Then we have on the end is Gail Foster. Gail is from Baker Botts. Gail practices exclusively in the area of e-discovery, focusing on the development and implementation of processes and strategies for preserving, gathering, reviewing, and producing large volumes of electronic data. Prior to joining Baker Botts, Mrs. Foster maintained an extensive trial practice focused primarily on complex, multi-party commercial litigation. There's Gail. We do not have Michael, but who do have, let me get the next slide here. So we have Rick Clark's joining us from ESI Analysts, and Rick is one of the co-founders of ESI Analyst, and today he's most focused on investigations involving the new and emerging data types like text messages, Slack, WeChat, geolocation, etc. And so we're going to get a chance to see their tool. He was going to show it earlier in another presentation, didn't get a chance to. So I thought it'd be a good use of our time for him to show his tool that shows something which is a common problem that a lot of us have. So that'd be a good time to show that. Last but not least, we have John Addington. John is a corporate e-discovery advisor currently with Corning's litigation department. He's worked for many years on the vendor, law firm, and corporation side of things. So a broad perspective. He's coming up from Austin. Previous to Corning, Mr. Addington worked at Dell, where he directed and managed the e-discovery in Dell's largest litigation matters. So the format's going to be, obviously you're going to be relaxed. It's the end of the day, and I know that everybody's ready to get to happy hour or get home. So we're not going to drag it out too long, but I know some of you, I've worked with some of you before in the past, and hopefully this will be an interactive session. I'm always interested in hearing how you all are solving some of these problems or coming up with solutions to unique problems. So, and now interjecting.
Well, I just want to say, logistic is. So we have a happy hour. If you guys don't know about it, it's on the site. We also have a handout that's over there. We have little chewing gum, like not tokens, but paper, so that gives you one drink at the venue. So if you want to go to the happy hour, we'll be out there with them. And And Epic and Special Counsel and Disco also have the cards. So I wanted to just say that because that's it.
So class dismissed. Let's go to the bar. Yeah?
It's right after the best session the whole day.
All right. So first question for the panel. Obviously, start at the beginning. When we're preparing for investigation, what are some steps that you would take? And I'll just open it up to the group, whoever wants to answer first. Vanessa, you look like you're ready to go. Or, go ahead, John. Go ahead.
I think we're going to talk a lot about some whiz-bang cool analytics tools, and they're great, but we forget that one of the best analytic tools is between our two ears, so we need to really think carefully and methodically at the beginning of an investigation. There's a quote from a mental health counselor that I thought fits real well with what we're doing here. It says, "I ask questions mainly as a means of trying to figure out what the real question is." So we need, at the beginning of an investigation, I find it important to ask a number of questions, especially questions surrounding facts that'll help you to filter the data. And then also it's important to understand the facts, but it's also important to understand who's most concerned about what types of risk, and that we proceed commensurate with the risk and the concerns for that risk.
Great.
So from a forensic accounting side, right, typically we get involved with either our internal counsel at our client or external counsel's been hired, right? So then they would bring us in to think through, books and records, e-discovery, sources of data. So we come at it jointly with counsel to think through what's our investigation plan. And so to echo John's points, right, what's the trigger for the investigation? What do we need to get our arms around? Another perspective that I bring is the audit side as well. So a couple things that come to mind when I'm involved in an investigation: if it's material to the financial statements, and/or does it involve integrity of management? Another stakeholder you may have, right, aside with, depending if it's a management-led investigation, if it's audit committee-led, is it a regulatory inquiry? Is it an internal whistleblower, right? So each of those things, so what is the trigger to think through who are the stakeholders to allow you to appropriately tailor that investigation plan, which will feed into your sources of data and your e-discovery. So I typically bring in the auditor perspective, because if they haven't been thought about as a stakeholder initially, if there is issues, material impact to the financial statements or integrity of management, they're going to want to know at some point. So I usually ask the question, have the auditors been brought in? They might not be under the tent at that point, and that might be appropriate, but just asking the question to have that conversation, because they'll have some thoughts, and I'll talk through those later, as to what are the right e-discovery considerations.
I probably don't need this because I talk really loud anyway. From my standpoint as the e-discovery lawyer, again, I think one of the best things that could possibly happen is that you sort of already know the lay of the land. Your e-discovery house is in order. You know where things are. You know how to find them, how to get them. So I think that from my standpoint, that's not often the case. And, I may be brought into something where I've never worked with that particular client before. So to me, the thing, is understanding, of course, what is the scope? What's this about? Why is this investigation going to happen? Has there been a governmental inquiry, a subpoena? Has there been a whistleblower complaint? Is somebody behaving badly? Is this an HR issue? What is going on? And then to also, and again, this is much like litigation, is to figure out pretty quickly, get the legal counsel, the in-house legal counsel, to put me together with IT so I can figure out where is everything and what do we need to do. And importantly for me, what can IT do? What is their bandwidth? What is their experience? What tools do they have? Because if they don't have the bandwidth to do this, or if they don't, even the low-hanging fruit, then we need to get someone in there right away to help. And I think that, again, the timeline, how critical is this? If you've got, in a lot of the governmental investigations, you're supposed to be producing things very quickly. So all of those things come together, but it's just the initial first step is, why are we here? Let me, as quickly as possible, figure out what needs to be, or what is available to be targeted, and who can help with that, and then, make the plan. But I think one of the most important things, we talked about this, is that you don't want to just dive in the deep end, because you may be way overkill, and you don't want to spend the time to figure it out up front, but you're going to spend a lot of time figuring it out on the back end, and that is just counterproductive.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd also say on the timeline is, are there any upcoming filings, right? So if the client that's having the issue has an upcoming 10K or a 10Q, and they're supposed to file, we're in filing season, most of our clients are filing next week. Whistleblower letters happen to come in right before filing for some reason, just to keep the auditors busy. But, that's another consideration, again, if it leads to the integrity of management or the material impact on financial statements. The other thing that, I might think about is, when you think about e-discovery, structured and unstructured data, what about financial records and general ledger and, those types of things. So that might be another source of data that we should need to think about, from either whether it's preserving, depending on where the issue is, or collecting, or, querying. So again, it's another source of data that should be thought about at the beginning.
Good. This sort of gets into the second question
Turn-
that's already been commented on about.
Turn you on there, John.
Sort of gets into our second question, but it relates to what's already been discussed about potential problems that you can create very quickly up front and waste a lot of time. So it's important to be precise as possible in your movements. I thought about the word overreact, but overreact may not be the correct word, because sometimes the threat is very large and looming. It's a big business deal that you're going to lose, or the headlines, the damage to the brand. So there is a lot of reaction that's necessary, but it needs to be very thoughtful and precise. It shouldn't be unreasonable shotgun, because, as has been said, if you overreact and just decide you're going to click, 50 custodians' email, image all these, several business divisions' computers, you've done the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish. You've just buried the facts. And now you're going to use a lot more resources, time, and attorneys reviewing it to find those facts. But if you're more precise and careful and ferret it out one step at a time, it's easier and quicker to find the facts.
Cool. And I'm going to throw the first curveball, and I'll open this up to the audience as well. Something I was thinking about as you guys were talking. One thing that might be important to point out, and maybe we can save this, table it to the end, but because our topic is focused on non-litigation matters, right? Is there what are some considerations that are different in those types of investigations as compared to in a litigation? Maybe something that we can flesh out as we're talking, unless something I was thinking about. All right. So we already talked common mistakes made in as you're preparing or getting ready for investigations. Anybody got
Well, I think
Gail?
that, and we've kind of mentioned this, it's diving in the deep end without, taking a little bit of time, taking a beat and figuring out what's important, and what kind of documents do you think, and also, where are these documents? If you've got, a lot of these investigations involve FCPA. There are things that are happening overseas, because a lot of people operate differently in other countries besides the United States of America, and so many of our clients are operating multinationally. So we have to consider that. So that brings into play, well, is there some kind of a data privacy scheme? In China, you've got the state secrets issues, which are just a real conundrum. And additionally, what about foreign language? Be thinking about that, because once you get all that stuff, what are you going to do with it? You've got to, that has to come into play in terms of your processing, and how am I going to staff the review, and do I have a tool that has translation on the fly that can help? But I think that again, it's just really important to understand what is this about, what's the most relevant data, where is it, and how am I going to get it so I can make a plan. I think that one of the things that I've seen happen that puts everybody in a tight spot is maybe someone having an overly ambitious idea about what they can do, what they can handle, particularly in-house. And also just, failing to understand internal limitations. And then just waiting too long to get help and to make a better plan, which then pushes everybody up against the wall. I mean, everyone, I'm sure in this room has had that situation where, you get the call the week before Christmas and you have to spend your entire Christmas holiday week working on something that probably could have been handled earlier, but it wasn't. So I think that's the thing, is that, the IT folks, God bless them, I never knew anything about how IT had to work and how everybody needs them all the time. But they want to be helpful, and they want to do everything that you need them to do, as well as everybody in the company, but they just, more often than not, they can't. So I think it's important to manage that. And I think that's just a big mistake that can happen, is not understanding what you can do and when you need help.
Yeah, just picking up on the FCPA considerations, right, and cross-border outside of the U.S. Oftentimes when we're going to collect data, image computers, we've already gathered, right, backups and servers, but we know that we need to look at local hard drives as well. Thinking about what certainly your policies are with respect to, and I know we're going to get into BYOD and other devices, but then consulting local counsel, right, as well as through your external counsel or internal counsel, because oftentimes, that might be, it's part of your policy that you have access to, whether it's a laptop or phone or whatever, but there might be some local requirements where you need a local notary, for example, to be present, and you need the chain of custody forms notarized. Lots of those types of kind of on-the-ground nuances that, if not considered initially, I mean, I've been in a collection, and this was early in my career, where we arrived on site and notaries don't work on the weekends, and we could not get a notary present to collect these devices, and so it kept getting postponed. And of course, everything in an investigation is, yesterday. And other countries culturally, they might not understand, the sense of urgency. So something, that's I think a mistake that I've run into from the audit perspective. As we're as an auditor, we have to meet certain standards for our audit clients when they're hiring external counsel to do, and/or consultants to do investigations. So a question I always ask, right, that standard is is the investigation reasonable? So it doesn't have to be what I would have done, but is it reasonable? Oftentimes, they've done a series of data preservation interviews and/or collection interviews, or they've just started interviewing witnesses, but yet that witness is not on the source of data. They didn't either image or collect. And they have a rationale, but they either can articulate it, it's not documented. So that's a question that I ask almost immediately, like, why is your witness list this, but yet your sources of data are this? And how did you get comfortable? And there's often explanations, but they just haven't been thought through. And then it just kind of causes more work on the back end to try to figure out why are those potential gaps. So that's, low-hanging fruit that I would think about on the front end.
All right, very good. So we've prepared, we've got a good plan. Now it's time to put it into action, okay? So when you're gathering evidence, what are some important things to consider for that process? John?
For some reason, if there's the chance that the users are going to be talking about something nefarious, they are more likely to use instant messaging or some social media tool, thinking that it's more private, even though it's on the organization's network. They think that if they keep it off of email, they can still maybe discuss it a little bit more. So it's just more important. If your traditional e-discovery is to grab the team SharePoint and the email, that's probably not going to cover it on an investigation. You might think of just other ways, other tools, social media tools that are used within the organization.
Okay, so that folds into the next question. And Rick, maybe this is a good one for you. What are some non-traditional sources of data that we should be considering, and what are some things that we should be considering for that collection?
Yeah, sure. So what we see, because we manage that data in our system, and we've been doing this for about a year now, the cases are like we saw in Enron or in the mid-2000s where email was, everyone was pretty cavalier there and everybody then started shutting that down and taking it elsewhere, we're finding that those text messages exist. It's amazing. We looked at some non-compete stuff and it was like, please, not supposed to, contact you, but, wink, wink, but here's my business card, right? It's a picture of his business card. So those exist in whether they're text messages, WhatsApp, other applications. So, from a real world standpoint, we actually see those cases come through with that data. And, Slack and Microsoft Teams and some of the other ones could be really important because that's where they've moved a lot of their conversations from email to Slack. They may not be cavalier. They're probably still going to be very structured in a business sense, but could be important to bring context around it. For instance, one of them was they're on a Slack conversation, and it was, we probably shouldn't continue, doing this on here. Went radio silent, text messages picked up, and you could see them, continue the conversation in text. So really putting, if it's important to the case, putting all those pieces together can be pretty helpful
Telling the story, right?
to tell the story,
Yeah,
right?
And it could be, there might not be anything nefarious, but it's just culturally the way they're communicating. So oftentimes when I'm working in Latin America, WhatsApp is how the people in the field, whether it's on the sales side or distribution, supply chain, they're just communicating because of the ease, because it's cheaper, it's free. And, most often, whether somebody has a laptop or not, text messages or not, they might have run out of minutes. I mean, there's just some practical uses where they just use WhatsApp for everything, to the point where when we were doing an investigation and we interviewed the whistleblower, he started sending me evidence on WhatsApp. He found me on what, it was not on my business card. He found me on WhatsApp and started sending me pictures. I'm like, oh, okay. So yeah, I mean, there might be, again, there's practical considerations, but certainly I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the evidence.
And I just say from the evidence gathering standpoint, I think, again, knowing what is this about and where does the company, where do people anticipate that sort of the nuggets are going to be? And most of the cases that I work on, whether they're, an SEC subpoena or an investigation, internal, whatever, more often than not, and this really influences, for example, when we're running searches to try to find things, is that more often than not, it's what we're talking about. What are people saying to each other? Like a lot of times when I'm, we're gathering, email's the low-hanging fruit. I mean, I also think that based on your conversations with IT, is you need to focus on the low-hanging fruit. What can I go get back in the background that we can work on quickly, and then we can figure out what else we need to get, whether it's, cell phones and all the other types of data. But go get that stuff as quickly as you can. It's, again, IT can usually grab that for you and get that party started so that you can look. But many times, particularly in investigations, if you're trying to use some search terms to get to wherever you're going, we'll run these searches. But for example, in the financial area, oh my goodness, the terms that they want you to run, gap and things like this, they are. Y'all can probably already hear me because I'm so loud, right? Former trial lawyer. But some of the terms are so generic, or they're found in every attachment in that particular group's email. So a lot of times what we really care about is what are they actually saying, notwithstanding what's attached, what are they saying, and we'll focus on running searches on emails. And I think you mentioned this, culturally, what is the lingo? How do people talk in this industry? What terms do they use? I mean, I did, years ago, I was involved in one where we had multiple countries that we were doing a post-merger acquisition due diligence review. And we were looking in India, and oh my goodness, they had the most interesting terms for bribe, and the what facilitated a bribe. And frankly, I actually kept a copy of that, and I've kind of keep it in my back pocket if any of those come up again. So I think understanding those kinds of things and in terms of your evidence gathering is I think you need to be thinking about where would I expect information to be, because you cannot get everything.
Right.
You can't. I mean, unless you've got, 8 months to deal with it, but you just can't get everything.
And I'll make a plug for so searching, so books and records, right? From an FCPA perspective, you have your anti-bribery provisions, you have your books and records and internal control provisions. So whether there's a bribe, certainly that's important. You also need to know where it's recorded and whether there were internal controls that were either effective or not. So we, low-hanging fruit, right, will look at specific accounts within the general ledger, but we'll also search it. So similar search terms that we're using for on the email side, on the text message side and chats, we search the general ledger and descriptions, and I've found where they've labeled certain payments as cooperation or gratification, not in English, in Spanish, but that was the description on the general ledger. So, and those were, in fact, the bribes, right? When we actually tried to pull the support, there wasn't, because they were in cash. We interviewed people and come to determine that's in fact what it was. But, so that's another area to think about too, thinking about non-traditional sources of data and searching that.
I think also it's important to keep in mind, what is your actual goal? What is your need? What is required for your next step? Because, with investigations, a lot of times it's not, overturn every stone. It's to find the smoking gun so that you can now conduct an interview with the right custodians and grill them and they confess. So get as quickly as possible to that type of information, which might be just reviewing a few social media accounts. And you get what you need to your next step, and you don't need to
That's right.
collect every resource at your company.
I have a question if you've got time. Yeah, so from a practical perspective, you all are in very different industries, right? From practicing lawyer to audit and ESI. I'm just kind of curious, on the front end, the planning phases or the investigation phase, so a lot of questions that you have to provide answers for. What are some workflows that you found or methods to memorialize the answers to those questions, to build knowledge and, kind of build your case out to where, you don't have to keep asking the same questions over and over again and you can share with your teams?
I devised an intake form which made the attorneys carefully think about all the facts that I needed to know to act on. And it was much different than an e-discovery intake form. But it also, like I was saying earlier, it made them think about, what is our shortest time constraint? We realized, maybe we think it could be 2 years, but what evidence do we have? What's the hot doc? What's the date of that one, And is it just one particular, is it a communication with one particular company that we're concerned about? So can we just search, emails to that domain?
John, just curious, what type of investigation was this? Did you already?
I'm just
specify?
saying, I'm
In
generalizing.
broad.
I'm not talking
General,
about
okay.
any investigation I've ever done.
Okay. Well, you said you had a form. I just was curious, so what type of, not specific, just what type of, was it just
Well,
fraud?
any investigation, whether it be, particularly investigations where there's just some alleged misbehavior going on, and you're trying to get to the bottom of it. But that can also even be helpful when there's a request for information, when there's even an agency has subpoenaed some information. It can still be useful to ask those types of questions to understand where to start.
I wanted to know in your areas how important it is to be flexible, because I know investigations, sometimes you think you have this timeline and you think you know, and then you actually get into the data and you discover 10 things, but you collected all the wrong things, you have the wrong custodians, and that's not bad, but
Sure.
do you run into problems where you told someone this is your plan and
Oh, yeah.
they bought into it, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh no, this is our plan. So how do you overcome that hurdle of, yes, the data's telling you to do that, but you now have to resell.
Well,
New
that should be
approach.
that should be the plan to begin with, that they understand that the goal is to get as narrow as possible with your facts, and then you're going to widen it as the evidence and the facts lead you to. So it's, by design may change, because that's what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a forensic consultant, right, I'm working for the lawyers, and as we start doing our analysis, it's honestly the flow of information. So we have constant between external counsel, internal counsel. We actually use kind of project management software and visualizations to kind of show them we just dug in, we just looked into these transactions, or we just did these interviews, and here are, the key things that are coming out of it. And we, depending on I'm working on an investigation right now where we have weekly, but oftentimes we're connecting more often than that. But we have our board that's laying out our key facts. So we kind of start with, here's where we are, here are our decision points, here's completed steps, here's the new findings, and we're constantly going back, and of course, none of that's a board that we have that we're sharing via WebEx or Hangouts. We're not sending things back and forth to create this written record of all these new facts that constantly change, right? So that's another consideration, is what is getting documented and circulated. But it's something that I think the communication piece, just with counsel, with your client, is important, because that's, as John said, that's the nature of an investigation. It's going to constantly change. You might find you're going down one path. Nope, never mind, it's actually going to go this way. So I think that's...
Yeah, I was going to say, that's an important workflow. I'm glad you mentioned that in investigations, to have, the vendor, probably consultants with the vendor, your outside counsel, inside project manager, if you have it. Sometimes it's just daily. You have to,
Yeah,
well,
could be
when it
daily.
starts, you have to have a daily meeting
Yeah.
to assess facts and assess where you're going to turn now.
Mm-hmm.
And that has proved to be very helpful, which is a total different strategy than I would use in a regular e-discovery manner.
Yeah, and from our perspective, we see our clients, because they're going after more than just email and maybe some other disparate data types that they have in their systems, and looking broader, is start small with your key actors, key custodians, maybe some specific chat types that you see a lot of activity, because when you do a collection off of the phone, you're seeing everything, but you don't want to analyze everything, right? You don't want to use all the tabs in Celebrate. So you start in maybe some of those key communication types and then expand out. And we do see that. It's almost like data is begetting data, right? They're looking at more and more different types, because they start splintering out into, different chat types and communication types.
All right, so I think I'm going to skip past this and move past. I think we have, but a lot of people have been covering this today. Just some other things to consider, obviously, during an investigation, the privacy issues and things like that. But I think in the interest of moving things along, we'll skip past this. If you're playing at home, we're going to be at question 9 now. So to that end, and I know, John, you mentioned it earlier. What are some ways, or what you said, hot docs or conceptual searching? What have you done or used? So we've collected the data. Now we're trying to hone in on it, as you said.
Yeah, there's several tactics that are useful. One of them is, even if you have keywords, sometimes the keyword string is very broad, and you're having a hard time. Council still wants to use it. I've used just a portion of the analytic tools, the random sampling, because the keyword that they're giving me hit on 10,000 documents. I'm not going to have all that reviewed, but I'll do a sample set of a couple of hundred, have those reviewed, and then refine those keywords based on what we've learned. So that's a way you can use kind of a portion of the typical TAR workflow in a more precise way to help hone your keywords, if you're going to use keywords. But one thing I found very valuable, particularly for investigations, because usually you do have some level of a hot doc, but I found in particular, there's like, I think it was said earlier, like splintering. There's usually, within investigations, it starts to go down different channels. And if you can get precision with the subset of issues, say this particular case, it started out with this set of facts, and now you've got these kind of 5 subset of issues. Get those 3 or 4 documents on this issue, and then run conceptually similar based on that small cluster. Because what I found is, if there's too many splinters of issues, and then you run analytics or that as a seed set, it sort of, depending on the tool, can confuse it a little bit.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're more precise with the documents, you feed in a seed to see what is conceptually similar to that, you get a more precise return. So that's one manner to do it. But even in cases where you don't have hot docs that you can use in that manner, if you know sort of the facts that are being alleged, well, just create a hot doc. You can create what you would expect maybe to see in that kind of a communication if they were really carrying on that activity. And that's your kind of your fake seed document's a hot doc. And you can see if there's anything within your corpus that's conceptually similar to that specific tool, document.
That's interesting. So creating a fake document, right, that would be your holy grail of what you're looking for, right? In the example here, we did just a conceptual search. So just like, again, if starting again, obviously everybody knows the Enron case. So we were searching for the term raptor, and then all of a sudden, these tools have the ability to pull in all these other terms that maybe you're not thinking about. So maybe speaking to that, what you mentioned, John, as far as like starting with that conceptual search, but then allow the technology to pull in some other words that maybe you didn't know. So like in this example, we have raptor, Jedi, exotic, Chuko. These were all entities, I guess, within that Enron organization. So that's, again, that technique, right?
Yeah, and I've seen where you can use the, maybe you did what I said to begin with. You got these hot docs. You found the conceptually similar. Then you review those that are similar. But as a QC step at the very end, you can look at the concepts. Each document, the tools like this will assign all these like concept terms to your documents. Maybe you need to widen the net a little bit more, because for each of those concepts, you can look at the other documents within the data set that weren't pulled in yet, just to make sure that there wasn't really another side activity or another accomplice working on a similar deal.
Yeah, I use tools like Brainspace so depending, if it's an internal investigation where I'm just trying to get at what the issue is, but I know I'm not dealing with the regulator, I know I'm not having to report back to my auditor, and again, depending on the number of hits coming back, I might do all my searching in Brainspace, and I might do all the review in there too. If it's something where I know the auditor's going to ask me, what was your approach? That we often refer to it as a waterfall. So how many documents did you collect? How many were responsive? How many did you review? How many ultimately ended up being hot, or did you rely on to reach your conclusions? So that's the questions I go through sitting on the audit side. Well, then you need to do your review in a tool that's going to tag, and you'll be able to recreate and reperform that search. In Brainspace, that's not necessarily possible, right, in doing these concept searches. So it depends, right? If you want to get an answer quick and easy and you're not going to have to reperform it and or document it or respond to, regulators, then Brainspace might be fine. Or maybe you just start in Brainspace to refine your search terms, and then that's when you move to the other tool whether it's, whatever it may be, that you're actually doing your tagging. So that's how we've used them.
Another way that I've used Brainspace too is in that, I forget what they call it, but it's the communication
The wheel?
graphical display. No, it's the one where it's the.
The people, the
The
nodes.
people with the nodes, with
The nodes, yeah.
and you can see the thicker lines when there's more communication. So you may think that this activity that took place was between these 3 or 4 people, but sometimes you'll see odd communication lines when you look at that graphical display. Like, why was this fellow that worked on the floor having why is there this thick line going up here to some executive that you knew nothing about, that has, it's not in his chain? Why is
Yeah.
that communication happening? And you can overturn, another, again, side problem.
Yeah, and you can find personal email addresses as well using this graphic, right? So if they're communicating or sending things outside of their work email addresses to personal, you can find, identify some of those so that you can hone in on some of those communications as well.
Here's another tool that does similar, where it's showing, again, the direction of the communications and who's talking to who, and making those connections, which obviously is going to be something important when looking at from an investigative standpoint. All right, so
I think maybe
Go
one
ahead,
other
go
thing I might mention, Gail mentioned, making sure that your search terms are tailored based on the jurisdiction that you're working in. A question I often ask when I'm wearing my audit hat is, what search terms gave you 0 hits? And that might be because you spelled it wrong, because it's not appropriate for the language or the jurisdiction. So that's another easy question to think about, and quickly look at your search term hit reports to make sure there's a reason. I mean, if it's something like kickback, well, how often do I write an email and say, oh, hey, I'm going to give you a kickback, right? That may make sense. But if it's something that you would expect would have some level of hits, that's a question I often ask as well.
I'd mention just a couple of techniques that we use. I mean, I think that an internal investigation is particularly suited to the Brainspace, TAR type, using those tools. But that being said, not everybody wants to do that.
Sure.
People don't want to spend the money, that maybe they, they're great and they can save a lot of time, but they also take some time on the front end. Maybe you don't have time. And so, a lot of the other tools, I mean, Relativity does have the ability, a great thing, gaps. I mean, if you find that particular custodian, isn't that interesting? They tend to have a gap, and Relativity can give you that. And I think also that just from a sort of a process standpoint, when we have a review team, we do have a hot tag, and we try to really coach about that. But I think it's important when you kick off that review, I really encourage the lawyers who are leading our reviews to set up an afternoon call every single afternoon for the first week and talk to people. What are you seeing? What's going on? If you find a name that is, we haven't talked about that person, you need to feed that to the legal team. I think another thing, in my experience, the legal teams that are doing this always want to develop a chronology. It's really important for them, when they're going to present to, if it's a government agency that prompted it or whatever may be the case. And I'm a real big fan of doing as much as you can in that, the 1L or the follow-on review. So if you're confident with your team, or maybe even the folks that they look at the hot documents. Maybe you have a process where hot document, you create a search, and hot documents are fed to the upper, folks every single day, or they drop in there and look at them. But you can also set up your review pane so that you can, I have one right now where should it go on the cron, and then there's a cron comment, so that then you can just export that out of your, just figure out what fields you want to show up there and export that. It also helps identify the documents that you want to maybe, everybody wants to print everything to PDF so that people can put it in notebooks and talk about it.
Yeah,
It's
that's right.
still very old school.
It is.
But that's what, we like paper. And
Yep.
so I think that there's a lot of things you can do in your processes that will produce work product
Yeah.
that these kinds of teams want. Now, and I'm really talking from more on the legal side and the sort of factual side.
Yeah.
Vanessa's area of the audit and the financial stuff is kind of a different,
Right.
a horse of a different color. But, just from the, how did this happen? What did this happen? What's a hot doc? What is a pivotal document or communication? I think those are just some of the things you can do. And they're kind of low tech, but they work.
I think Relativity has the ability to create a chronology for you, to do a timeline. So depending on documents you've tagged, I think it has that capability. What is it? Case dynamics.
So, and I think we're all saying the same thing. One thing that I found is important, and what teams is good from a low-tech standpoint, right? I think the workflow using continuous active learning, TAR 2.0, is pretty common now. It's pretty accepted, right? Where you're bubbling up the good stuff to the top, right? It's the idea of my friends in Dublin say it's just like a Guinness. The good stuff comes to the top, right? So you're the idea of that. Even if you have a low-tech attorney or reviewer, they're tagging, and it's just like the Pandora theory, right? Where you're feeding the good stuff, the key documents, and the ones that aren't so important, they're getting shipped. So it's a continuous a process, right? And so they're looking at the scores and how the documents are being scored, and then they're able to make that decision. Another curveball question: in your experience, when you have reviewers who are using that scoring technology, right, where they're getting a score based on what the AI says, this document may be responsive. It has to be, but have you seen bias from your reviewer's standpoint, where it's they're saying, okay, maybe this is responsive, even though I don't think it is, right? do you tend to hide that information from them? The score, right? And so I want a true answer. Do you think this is responsive or not? Even though it is scoring and still bring the good stuff to the top. But like, do you find that, is there some sort of bias? Curious. I've seen that happen.
I haven't, I'm glad you're bringing that up. I'm going to think about it now and maybe think about how to use that in cases. But the thing that I think really helps is if you encourage just ongoing dialogue, that it's okay to ask questions. So as part of that daily, session each day, you want people to say, I think these were supposed to be responsive. I'm not sure why they're marked so high, and then talk through that and see what the issue is.
Yeah.
Sure. And in the interest of, again, I'm going to move along a little bit. The idea of sentiment analysis, I think, is a new concept of like, okay, especially from an investigative standpoint, let's look at the data and find those anomalies, or let's look at it and find those sentiment. I think it's a good way of bringing those things up to the top. Using custodian profiles, things like that. We've talked about this. We talked about that. All right, alternative scenarios and applications, because we're getting close to the end. First thing I want to do is, Rick was talking earlier about when you were trying to look through, you're looking at text messages or other types of data. What's the best way to go through it? So Rick has a tool that they've developed, and he's going to show us real quick what that looks like.
Yeah, so can you hear me okay? So what we've done here is we're looking at all of the various disparate data types. It's a different approach. Concept doesn't necessarily work when you have 2 words and then maybe 3 words. Sounds good, right? Maybe sentiment analysis could work. But what we've done with our system is we're now looking at the new wave of data like it is. It's metadata, it's images, it's videos, and we're not creating documents out of those, but actually putting all of these pieces together. So communication data, computer activity, so this is user-generated, opened up a file folder, saved something to a hard drive, financial transactions you were talking about earlier, putting those elements together. And so what we're doing is looking at a full approach and creating better ways to analyze this communication. So for instance, we'll look at the most frequently contacted, and you could say, all right, so who's Philip Allen been mostly talking to? And this is all text messages, could also be emails, could be Slack, WhatsApp, any of your different communication types here. You can drill into that data and look right at those specific conversations. So you can go look at that conversation, look at the 24-hour thread. So what were they actually talking about? So we'll create a thread ID on 24 hours of communications, create those bubbles, and you can actually see what exactly they were talking about. And so then what we're doing is creating the basically analysis or link analysis around all of the different data types. So for instance, if I have an example here of they were in Montana, we found, and they had a geolocation point that was registered from their cell phone. You then have a text message, more geo points, and you can then actually look at those types of conversations. And I have an example here that includes media, where they took pictures, sent videos, and things like that. So we'll create a 24-hour thread ID and a master thread off of the complete conversation that's gone over. Could be a span of years, but could also just be them sending pictures of their vacation. If there's a video, you can play the video, bulk tag these things as well. I'm really just skimming the surface on how to start showing how our system does that, but the idea is if we treat it all like metadata, we don't treat them like documents, and we let it all interact by creating actor profiles and allowing you to see the data that you want to present. So a lot of employment law is, I used an example a couple weeks ago. I'm in New York. Well, if there's a non-compete, they're not supposed to be in New York City. You can do a date range of that week, see where their geopoint's registered, look at their text conversations, see if they switched over to Slack, the same things I was saying earlier. So this is just kind of a hint of what the new way to analyze that data is, but that's what we're doing here.
Awesome.
Okay.
So we'll run up against it. So
Yeah, I'll let you go, John.
So the next, we'll just carry this on to 6 then, because we have a lot more information to get through. So one of the goal of this, my initial goal, was to get through some of these alternative scenarios and uses of applications. But that's okay. I'll save that for next year. We'll continue this discussion next year. But before I move on past that, any real world examples of like, I think of like due diligence for real estate deals. You know, or is there anything that you guys have done that's kind of outside the box, or any sort of scenarios like that?
One situation I know of is a data dump that was allegedly establishing indemnification duties, but there was no metadata delivered with the file, so we're just supposed to presume from a big set of data whether you know we really do have a requirement there to indemnify for various potential or alleged violations. So we're using Brainspace for that to better understand more quickly. And our intent is to put in, like I said earlier, we have the language of the agreement, which was the criteria for what indemnification duties we would have. So we're just going to use that as a hot doc and see what is in the data that looks like that document, and see if it, you know, if we can quickly make some good arguments about, you know, whether we have a duty or not.
Great. Anybody else? Aaron, you had your hand up. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Tom.
Employ it to get rid of.
Oh, deletion. Yeah, defensible deletion. That's a good one, right? Now I'm looking kind of at you people, corporate type people. Have you ever, or do you use, so there are tools now that allow you to use your past data, stuff that were from prior litigations, or not even litigations, investigations, right? And then apply that to your active data to proactively analyze risk. Have you ever seen anything like, or heard of?
So we help the client think through it. So remediation, right? As you identify issues throughout your investigation, you need to be thinking about how to remediate those, making the appropriate changes. We had a client that was being investigated by the DOJ, entered into a non-prosecution agreement, had a monitor, and as part of the monitor's mandate, they had to be monitoring for certain email communications as well as contracts and so on. So we took a lot of what was learned from the investigation side and applied that to do some proactive monitoring on the email side. So it was interesting because they, their data retention was all over the place. So the monitor wanted us to go back to when a contract was signed. Well, that was 20 years ago, right? Versus not necessarily a set time frame, but we worked through that with them to think about what custodians, what time frame, what are we capturing, and what are we doing. Again, you're monitoring, it's proactive, it's not an investigation. So a lot of the comments that we said at the beginning with, not a scorched earth, this applies much more so in this case, right? You don't want to come back with a million results and not even be able to review those. That would look poorly for the regulators to say, oh, you're monitoring and you just didn't even look at what you got back. So we applied that and used that as an approach, both on the email side, but then also on the contracting side. So we knew certain contracts were problematic. We ran it through one of the contract analytic tools that, can identify similar language, and they would pop back results, and then we would take a look at those. So, that's one example that we did for a client.
So I pulled up a slide here. NextLP has a tool that, you guys were mentioning Brainspace, and the NextLP has a tool that sits on top of active data, and it bubbles up those things that you might not be thinking of. And hey, this is a potential risk based on what you guys think is a risk, or you have in the past, and so it's bringing those up to the forefront. So maybe you can catch it before it becomes a problem, right? So this is, again, the type of analysis, and I'm getting the cut. I want to thank you guys for your time. Thank you guys for sitting through this, and if you guys have any questions, obviously, we'll be around, and I'm going to turn it over. Oh, thank you. Thank you, guys.